There's some suggestion this morning that Labor's proposed tax cuts could delay any cut from the RBA in the official cash rate. So let's get some clarity around it. Joining me now is AMP Chief Economist Shane Oliver. Shane, what do you think of that?
Look, it's certainly a risk. In fact, from an economic point of view, it's the biggest short-term risk to those adjustments that were announced last week. Basically, what happened there, of course, was that the tax cuts for higher income earners were reduced in favour of low to middle income earners, which you could argue, some might argue, is fair, putting aside longer term issues, of course. But the downside, of course, is that high income earners tend to save a big chunk of their income or after tax income, whereas low to middle income earners are likely to spend a much bigger chunk of it. So consequently, the adjustment to the stage 3 is probably more inflationary than the original stage 3 proposals were. That said, I don't want to sort of over-exaggerate it. There's an extra $804 a year going to low to middle income earners. That's something like $15 a week. It's going to be spread out over a 12-month period, so it's not like the so-called LMITO, low and middle income tax offset, where you get that $1,000 as soon as you fill in your tax return or soon thereafter. But that's the risk, that it adds to inflationary pressures, and the Reserve Bank might think, well, we might have been considering cutting interest rates in June, which in fact is our base case. They will start cutting interest rates in June, and I think that would be justified by the inflationary trajectory we're seeing. But they may now decide, well, we better wait a little bit longer just to see what the impact from those tax cut adjustments has been.
Yeah, right. So economists at the end of last year were predicting perhaps a rate cut not happening to the, Q4 of this year or perhaps into next year. What has changed that timeline then? Why has that timeline been brought forward, in your view, to potentially June?
Look, I think it's been brought forward because we've got much lower inflation numbers. I mean, mind you, our forecasts at the end of December last year were for a cut from June. We're at the optimistic end of economists, whereas you say most economists were in the December quarter. Whereas, of course, since then, particularly yesterday, we've seen more good news on inflation. Those who are expecting further rate hikes seem to have given up on that one. And those who are expecting rate cuts to come later have started to pull forward their expectations. But just bear in mind that the November statement of monetary policy from the Reserve Bank had inflation at the end of last year at 4.5%. It came in at 4.1%. Even the underlying measure was significantly below their forecast. So that's going to mean that the RBA will, all things being equal, lower their inflation forecasts. Obviously, a fly in the ointment there is the tax changes. But I think as things currently stand for this year, we're looking at lower inflation than might otherwise have been the case, simply because inflation has been coming down quicker.
I just want to put this to you, and it's more of a political point, but there's an economic aspect to all of it. So the coalition on one hand is saying, well, $16 a week for the low income is not going to be enough, but they haven't guaranteed that they'll pass that cut. When it comes to inflation, I mean, $16 a week doesn't sound like all that much. Is that the inflationary aspect you're worried about, or is it higher up the income scale?
Look, higher up the income scale, they're getting less of a tax cut. So it's not going to be higher up the income scale. It's just that some money is going to low and middle income earners that wasn't otherwise going there. And the odds are a chunk of that will get spent. So that adds a bit of inflation.
And with the inflation coming down and that money going into people's pockets at this point or in July, that creates that risk?
That's right. You've got two conflicting forces here. On the one hand, the inflation numbers are coming in lower than expected. So that means perhaps earlier rate cuts than many economists had been expecting. Flip side, of course, is the tax changes, which have added a bit of spending power into the economy that might not otherwise have been there. And that adds a bit of inflationary risk. So you've got to try and work out the balance of those two opposing forces. At present, our view is that the tax changes aren't significant enough to change the trajectory for what the Reserve Bank does, but there's obviously a risk there. And you could argue that if the government was really interested in cost of living pressures, they would have been better off to do what they did last year. More energy bill relief, more rent assistance. those sorts of things, which have the effect of pulling down headline inflation and therefore pulling down inflation expectations, rather than doing this approach, which muddied the waters regarding what the stage 3 tax cuts were trying to do in the first place.
Shane Oliver, we always appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Laura. Take care.